Sorry, just I'm trying to. Okay. Um, huh. For some reason, I need to cancel that. Sorry, I'm not sharing the right. Let me get it from. Yeah. Yeah, here they are. Um, ah, hmm.
If you want, I could share.
Yeah.
There we go.
Can you see them? Yeah. Yes,
Yep.
sorry about that. Okay. So welcome everybody. It's great to have you for today's session. And as always, we have our community agreements as a reminder before we start that everybody's welcome here, regardless of all differences, whether race, ethnicity, gender identity, ability, or disability. And we are all welcome in this space, making space for ourselves and others. And that all our ideas are welcome. And when we disagree, we critique ideas, not people. And we are encouraged to, excuse me, to assume positive intentions, be generous with our interpretations of other people's comments, and do our best to be as equitable and hostable as always. This session will be recorded, so if anyone would like to rename themselves for the purpose of this session, please go ahead and do so. You can do it under participants. You'll find that you can rename yourselves, and if you find any difficulty, just message me or Heather, and we'll be able to support. Thank you so much, and John, it's they're all yours. Please start with what you have today. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Great to be here, as always, with MYFest. I am going to do an intro and a sort of a provocative point of departure, and then really hope to engage you guys in a discussion about the future of the web. And in particular, the sort of health of our kind of shared database of knowledge as represented by the things that we find online. And this is, I think, relevant to anybody, but particular relevance to those of us who kind of care about stored knowledge or curated information, but also who are educators who have to work with kids who are figuring out, okay, I once, when I was young, you went to the card catalog and then there was like Google, and now Google has by default turned to AI generated summaries. So I think we're all familiar with what the tech pros say are the positives here, but what we might not be familiar with is some of the potential downsides, especially if we think in sort of the kind of futuristic version of this technology and kind of think past the current horizon. That's my goal for us to do today. And I'm really excited to share with you as part of that an internet artwork that hopes to kind of make that like front and center, like really show the possibilities and the dangers, as well as an exercise that you can do yourself to see how the web might look. I literally built this in the last couple of days, so it's fresh off the press. And it's a way for you to sort of imagine what your browsing experience might look like in this transformed, in a world transformed by AI's impact on the internet. So without further ado, I will go ahead and jump in. Catalog generation. Okay, there's more than one of us here, and please, I'll be kind of looking at the chat as we go. This is not a lecture. This is us back and forth. So, but I also would be really grateful to May and Heather if they can jump in and say, "Hey, John, be quiet. Someone raised a really important issue," because I'd like to make this interactive. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen real quick just to set the stage. Okay, so you should see a sort of grayish website with the words personalization or ensloppification written. Everybody see that? Yeah. So ensloppification is a coinage based on Cory Doctorow's famous enshittification, which is a description of how what we might call Web 2.0 modified the web in a bad way. And this is particularly when advertising-based models like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube started to influence what people saw by making it really easy to create content and add it to the web before you had to know how to write a web page or get it hosted. And then to essentially feed people algorithmically determined selections of content so that they never, actually looked for something particular, but they actually were fed it as sort of coming to them as opposed to going out and searching for it. And that's, commonly referred to as Web 2.0. There have been various sort of candidates for Web 3.0. Some people say, oh, blockchain is going to be Web 2.0. Oh, semantic web is going to be 3.0. Well, those didn't materialize. But I think there is this sort of, other version of Web 3.0 that's even scarier than Web 2.0, but it's in some ways a kind of algorithmic sort of acceleration of it that's made possible by AI. So what I want to do today is sort of like raise this question of what happens if the web becomes personalized. Sounds good, right? Oh, personalized tutors. Every student can be working at their own pace and get just the information they need. But what's the sort of, bad side of that? What's the evil that can come from overly personalizing the content we get? All right, so AI is changing the web, and I think this is happening in 3 stages. It's already happened in 2 of them, and what worries me is that it could happen in the third. The first is AI augmenting a human author. So, we're writing an email, and I want to be tactful when I'm writing to my boss, because otherwise I'm going to be cursing and kind of saying exactly what's on the top of my mind. So I'm going to ask Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT to, tone it down, make it sound polite, fix the grammar, and so on. And obviously that extends to other media, from, writing code to creating images, videos, songs. And there are various complaints about that, and there are various kind of people who champion that, and there are good arguments on both sides. Stage 2 is AI competing with the human author, and this is where I think it gets harder to justify AI's intrusion into the web. We'll talk about exactly examples of how that's happening. I've had it happen to me personally in a way that's kind of shocking. But that's what I think of as the next stage, and some people are starting to actually experience this, where their own works are essentially being replaced by AI surrogates. And then the last one is AI totally replacing the human author. And this is where I think it's the most nefarious, because it won't necessarily be visible. If you're competing with another version of yourself, well, you can say, hey, that's me. But if there's a kind of creation that that essentially is not from the voice of an author, the creator doesn't determine what's there, but the viewer or listener or reader actually is the determinant of what content they see. That's when things get really scary. So we do not trust ourselves with our own messages? Well, that'll be interesting to hear, Alan, what you think when we get to this next part. So augmenting the human author, I think we all know what value it has to say, like, oh, okay, write my email for me, or, do this spreadsheet formula that otherwise I have to learn Excel to do. I think the downsides, though, are also somewhat clear to those of us who work in, kind of knowledge and cultural heritage, but they're not always clear to the tech bros. They seem to think that often there are no downsides. So as an example, here you have a recent paper proposing what they call critical confabulations. And anybody know what they mean by confabulations, what that means in an AI context? It's a different word for a very common word that is used that starts with an H. May you know what that is? May you know what that is? Yeah, hallucination. Yeah. So there's many use the term hallucination for many reasons. It's sort of implying an animism or sentience where there isn't one, and there's a whole psychological. There is a reason that you were using this weasel word instead of just saying we're fabricating falsehoods instead of fabricating truths. But one of the words that's been proposed to substitute for that is confabulations, which I don't think is a big improvement. Sounds fancy, but um, it does suggest the sort of like, the kind of imaginary status of things that are generated by AI, as opposed to factual status. However, in this paper, the authors propose to use confabulations in what they call a critical way. And their premise is that there's a lot of missing data in archives. In particular, there's a lot of missing data about marginalized groups, Black people, women, folks from the third world. There's a preponderance of white male, content on the internet. And so this premise of this paper is we could go back and fill in the missing content of marginalized people, and then they'd be better represented in our cultural heritage. I think this is a horrible idea. I think it was, roundly criticized on certain sections of the internet for being, kind of, I don't know, a colonial project disguised as an anti-colonial project. But it is an example of this idea of like, if we push this idea of like, oh, you're going to augment the sort of author, well, you're kind of, you're augmenting a factual archive by introducing non-factual material isn't necessarily helpful, right? So this sort of synthetic data. Another problem that comes from, media is when you say like, well, I'm going to use AI to sort of fix up images, right? In your phone, whether you're not, this is where the anti-AI camp, I think, just doesn't understand that AI pervades everywhere. So, my iPhone, when I take a photograph, is using AI to improve the photograph. And it does it even if I don't go and edit the photo. It's doing it simply by virtue of the process by which the photo is recorded on my little hard drive. But one of the dangers there is that we know that this involves compression, right? It's lossy. You don't get all the pixels you had in the original. So you might have a sunset that you took, and these little kind of artifacts in the corner, and they're little blotches, and they sort of like obscure the beauty of the sunset. Well, AI might remove those because it's like, hey, I'm running an algorithm that says like this orange here and yellow here, and there's no reason for there to be other colors in between them. But maybe those were birds, and that's the whole reason you took the picture was to get these birds. And yeah, they're out of focus and they're far away, but like, oh wow, look at these birds that you never see. So it's hard to tell when compression is going to remove outliers that are actually valuable. And if you extend that metaphor from like imagery to culture at large, we can see that, this sort of, whether we're filling in gaps based on the presumptions of AI of what, say marginalized people would add to the cultural record, or if we're actually removing outliers that are like, oh, that looks like that should be airbrushed out. Those are bad things. And I think that those are problematic uses of AI, or dangers that we have to be attentive to, especially if we deal in, anything curatorial or sort of or factual based. But stage two, I think, is even scarier. So stage two is when AI is like out competing humans. And you probably heard about artists and designers who are worried about their work. Like I used to get paid to make logos to, for, I don't know, for stores or nonprofits or whatever. And now those students of mine, their livelihood's really in question. Same with coders, right? Companies aren't hiring junior, developers like they used to. There are many reasons for that, but the stated reason is that AI can do the job for them. So I want to bring up a couple of, again, sort of nuanced issues that we might not have thought of immediately besides the economic one, which is a loss of provenance, right? So if one of the justifications by the tech bros is, hey, it's all art, and artists have always, kind of dug into the past and sort of derived value and built upon what other people have done. There's nothing new in the sun. It's always going back and sort of, building upon a tradition that you inherited as an artist. So that sounds good. And it sounds like a parallel to like these large language models that go out and, download, the entire internet, or at least the common crawl, or go and harvest all these images from Reddit and DeviantArt and Flickr and so forth. And you could say, well, they're just doing the same thing. They're just being inspired by tradition, by the information and the images and the art that they suck down. The difference is that if an artist works from another artist's work, they know who that artist is. they're almost always, at least the good ones, inspired by very specific, if not artists. Then there are certain movements, genres, histories. These all inform the artistic process. But you can't name the artists who are producing a generated image by Midjourney or Dolly or whatever. Those media generators that are AI driven are sort of post digestion. They've sort of digested the meal, and then what comes out is this kind of like just generic, version of what you prompted for. You can't say, oh, this is 30% Picasso and 20% Brock and 10% Juan Gris. There's no way to dig back in and figure out, because that digestion process erased all the provenance. So for creators and for art historians and critics and people who care about how art or media is created, there's no chain of evidence. There's no sort of way to track back to the original sources. That's one problem. Another problem is the loss of human incentive. If we don't have, culture, if people stop making drawings because it's easy to get AI to make drawings for them, we won't have human-made drawings. And in particular, we won't have them in the internet. And then we get into the snake, eating its own tail of like the AI models training on the latest data, but that data turns out to be synthetic. So it just sort of becomes this telephone game. So it's a lot of problems with that. As examples, I mentioned artist-generated. Actually, go back earlier because I think it's an even cleaner example. Some of you may have known that Grammarly started to say, well, from the perspective of Hemingway, your writing is taut and muscular, or from this perspective of Stephen King, your story has good characters but lacks kind of motivation or something. And the authors whose names were being name checked in this way were horrified. They're like, why are you parroting my, kind of critique or assuming how I would respond to this example? So this is a very clear example of kind of competing with instead of asking some famous author, fiction or nonfiction, what they thought of this, you literally just have the AI model simulate sort of critique by that author. Same has happened with artist websites. So on the left, you have a well-known game called Micropolis, where this is not the official website of that game. This is an AI generated one that the creators found. On the right is a website by Michael Neymark, a well-known new media artist, who also found this AI generated website. And you look at the image, if you've seen enough of these, you're like, that really looks AI generated. And it had this sort of like fanciful descriptions of his works, and none of it was real. So several artists have found that their websites, that their own websites are being eclipsed by these kind of ersatz versions. And this is not like you've heard about AI, generated music on Spotify. That's augmenting authors in the sense that someone is querying these things and then posting them and there's a new AI generated band, a country band that's hitting the charts or whatever. No, this is actually AI like finding actual artists and taking their names and whatever description or info they can about their work, and then creating these sort of ersatz websites based on them. So this happened to me. And on the left are the two examples of this website. The one on the left is a site from 2006 called Cross Cultural Partnership, or Connected Knowledge was the original domain. And it was created with the folks on the right, who all people who are legal experts, anthropologists, and members of 20 different indigenous nations who created an alternative to copyright. We were looking, this is like 2006, so it's like height of the sort of the copy wars, the copy fight. And it was like, what can we learn from indigenous culture that will help, kind of find other ways besides, information wants to be free, or, copyright law, maximalism. And so that it's an older website, it's an older style, and it hasn't gotten, as much attention in the last 20 years. So I was like, I think I pay for a ton of domain names. I was like, I can't pay for all of them. I'll just let this domain name slide, and I'll just keep the site alive in a folder on my own website. So anyone could get to it, but they couldn't type in connectedknowledge.net anymore. Well, a year or two later, I accidentally type in that domain because I'm still used to typing it. And I see the site on the right, which has almost exactly the same content, same photographs without the permission of the indigenous people who we got to share them. But extra things like new kind of, a sort of about page with fictional addresses for the people who made this. And, it has many of the same quotes and much of the same content. It's not even factually that inaccurate, but it's this super bland sort of like average website, kind of WordPress website theme. And I was just like, what the hell? So I went to the about page and I tried to like email them. And when I did, it didn't come back. But I noticed that when I did a who is, which is there's a way on the internet to figure out who's registered a web page, it came from Reykjavik in Iceland, and Michael Neymerk's website also came from Reykjavik. So someone's busy in Iceland duplicating, artists' websites. It was super ironic in this case because the whole point of the site was sort of like, how do we create ways of respecting other people's culture while we share it? That's definitely not what was going on here. So Alan's reading the synthetic eye. Yeah, that would be interesting. The sort of parallels to photography are quite interesting. As for the question of the term mirage, I do like that better than hallucination, but it is still a kind of you only see a mirage if you're embodied like a sentient being. Anyway, something else we could talk about. So let's get to stage 3, where an author is replaced. In my case, it didn't actually replace the site because I still had the old site. It just kind of created another one next to it that was competing with it. But replacing a human author is pretty wild. And this is where I'm going to show you an example of how this would work based on the artwork. So this is called websim.ai. It's a website you can go to and like literally type in, like I typed in malaysia.travel and it generated this website for me. And this website does not exist. And that domain name does not exist. It sort of creates the web on the fly. So what I mean by replacing the author, again, is not that it looks and finds Stephen King and writes stuff in the style of Stephen King. This is where there is an invented author that's invented because of the user's preferences and biases. So when I typed in malaysia.travel, it said, there's a user who wants a site called malaysia.travel. I'll pretend like one exists. Boom, right? So where this gets really scary, that the websim.ai is just kind of a fun site to explore things, and people made crazy stuff there. But this is a really scary part of it. This is Perplexity CEO Aravind Srinivas saying on a Hard Fork podcast, what is advertising in this medium, right? So you're thinking about people like Google, you're thinking about places like Perplexity, where students or scholars or whoever goes to find knowledge, right? Maybe we don't have ads on the site anymore. Google used to have ads, in a separate part, not in the main, kind of list of blue links. Then the 10 blue links got moved down and they put links at the top with a very subtle indication that, oh, these could actually be sites that have ads. Well, in the world of AI, we don't necessarily even have sites anymore, lists of links. We have paragraphs that are returned to us. How would an ad work in just a paragraph of an AI, overview? One of the things they can do is to affect the text itself. That is, instead of serving content and then add somehow buried in there like product placement or on the side, the very content that you're served could be subtly or overtly modified to serve some commercial purpose. So what does he say? He says, is advertising influencing the answer? Could you get a different answer from Google if someone paid Google to give you, to bias toward desiring some product, whether it's sneakers or, moving to a certain, city or political affiliation. I thought that was terrifying, the follow-up you asked, trying to incentivize the user to ask certain things. This was like one of the most, Bond villain sort of quotes that I've seen, and that's saying something among tech pros. So my colleagues Janet Cohen, Keith Frank, and I created a piece where we tried to demo how that would work. And I'm going to share a link to this in the chat so you can try it yourself. Let's see. Okay, so I've just shared a chat, but to make it easy, I'll just kind of bring it up in a window here. Okay. So this is a website, part of we have done a lot of different collaborations over the years. Many of them were analog. And this is a website we created to document our past projects. So installations, performances, that sort of thing. But we wanted to see like what would happen if in this process, the people who came to the site determined what was seen. And this has a certain parallel that any artist knows, which is if you have a curator or another artist or someone come to your studio, they always bring their biases, they bring their agenda, and they interpret your work based on that agenda. But we're used to thinking that at least there's like a factual content that you could go to the web and see, a neutral kind of consistent text depending on who you were. But in this case, what we did is we gave this sort of like preview here where you can click on. And when you do, you get a sort of like, okay, I'm going to click this little Mondrian painting. And now on the left-hand side is a little chatbot terminal. It says initializing formalist bias rewrite. Prompt, your role is a consummate formalist whose analyses of artwork are based purely on appearance and any superficial resemblance to other artworks or cultural artifacts based on color, shape, and other aesthetic properties. You will not consider theoretical, political, or biographical context for the work. And then on the right-hand side, you see the text being written on the fly. So this is what the web could become. It could become a world where there is no static HTML. Depending on the biases that the browser or the website knows about you, it will rewrite that text to match your preferences. And then if you go and click around some of the other projects here, you could see like, oh, this is this description of this other work by these artists. And everything's going to be described in completely neutral terms, there's sort of, classical discus thrower framed against a voided wall plane that flattens the gesture. It's very like formal. But if you say like, well, what if it was more on the sort of, theoretical side? Let's push the theory side. Someone clicked the book. Now you get the chatbot saying, initializing a theoretical bias rewrite. Your role is a consummate bookworm whose analysis of artwork is based on the extent to which they illustrate trendy academic theories of art and culture. Ignore former properties, da-da-da. So now you will see the text on the right rewritten on the fly here so that it's now, instead of talking about, colors, it's a semiotic agonism and, a tactical inscription of bodies in architectural space. It gets very theoretical and like, highfalutin. And this is true in the world of art. People come in with their own perceptions. But what if you came to our website and you didn't know that the content was being tailored exactly to your choices? May has a question.
Yeah. So are whatever is being written on the spot, is it could be fabricated or could be true, like similar to the others, the first few risks, the three risks you mentioned in the beginning, or is it like,
So it is
or
with
is it just tailored specifically to the person who's reading in this
it's
moment?
it's tailored to the person who's reading. Now, we picked an example where interpretation is the name of the game when it comes to art. There are factual things that everyone could come in and say, oh, that painting's green. Most people could look at the Washington D.C.'s reflecting pond right now and say that it's green, even though a few people have said it's not. But then there's a whole level of interpretation, right? So the orange text is kind of the sort of standard factual neutral part. And then there is a sort of like, how are you going to describe the artwork? If you pick, for example, let's say I go back to sharing here for a sec. Let's say that I pick you should see the screen again. If I pick the gun, well, that is a sort of very sensationalist political sort of interpretation, right? It says initializing political bias rewrite. And now it's going to take, what was a kind of dry, kind of academic language of the theoretical viewpoint and rewrite it. It says your role as a consummate ideologue whose analyses of artwork are based on conspiracy theories, extreme political partisanship, and sensationalist readings. And now, escalated civilian conflict is actually what this piece is about. And a domestic studio becomes a contested zone where speed, force, and reaction play out like miniature insurgencies. So the AI is taking the prompt and rewriting the interpretation to match that person's bias. Does that make sense?
And that's based on stuff I've worked on before online or research. So it takes from my interests and creates something relevant to me, whereas the next person sitting looking at the same thing will get different interpretation.
So that would be a potential future, dystopian future in my mind here. In this case, we tried to model it very simply by just making it based on which picture you choose. Choose a
Okay.
book, you're into theory. Choose a person's face, you're into biography. Choose a gun, you're into politics and violent or sensational stuff.
Mhm.
So it's a very sort of it's almost a kind of toy version of that tracking. But one of the things we've talked about as a group of artists is like, what if we actually somehow tracked a viewer's like browsing history, or they did a questionnaire or some other way that we could interpret more and with more nuance what they were looking for, and what kind of content would be likely to appeal to them. So May, you basically anticipated a potential extension of this
Oh,
piece. um, any other questions on that?
There are some questions in the chat.
Yeah,
Um,
let's talk about it.
yeah, Mia asks, I want you to speak more about what you mean here in terms of practices.
Oh, I was actually directing that to Alan's comment because, yeah, it was like a thread within a thread, a small thread, but it basically, I said, John, I'm still, you speak fast and you're brilliant, and I'm like stuck in these like deep reveries of what you're saying, and then I'm like find myself catching up to what you're talking about, like 30 seconds later because I'm stuck in what you said 30 seconds beforehand. So that happened when you said um, there's a web. There will be a web where there's no static HTML. So I got stuck in that, like pondering that while you kept talking. And then Alan wrote, "This happens if we stop creating the web." And then I responded to Alan, "I want you to speak more about what you mean here," meaning Alan was the one who said creating the web, but I need you both to talk to me about this because I feel like I just need to listen
Yeah, I want to
because
hear what
because
Alan
I'm
was.
confused. Because I'm intrigued. I know there's a lot going on in my brain, but I just want to be in conversation with you about what all this means.
Alan, let's hear what you were thinking about.
Oh, I mean, there's this, I mean, what this move is like, we've all moved to platforms and people have abandoned having their own domain or having content that they create themselves. So, and it feels like it's happened on a mass scale, but there's still a large undercurrent of people who are still creating their own content, creating static HTML, innovating, creating things. It's small web, people call it, and it just gets kind of lost in the underbrush. But we tend to think it's this, and it is this generalized sweeping motion of putting our content into platforms instead of owning it ourselves. And so, um, as long as I'm around, there's going to be static HTML because, I'm dedicated to doing stuff where I can control it. And so that's this huge shift that's happened is that we're expecting, we've kind of given up a lot on, because it's a lot of work and people didn't want to do it. And then we got tired through COVID and it was just too much work. But I've seen so many people, and Mia, this is the stuff we did in net now.
Yeah, yeah,
We made stuff and yeah, it wasn't
yeah,
always in our own domain, but we were building and exploring. And it's easy to think it's gone, but it's not. It's just quiet because there's so much
yeah.
attention on this other stuff. So I'm still very positive about it. I see stuff every day I come across. I don't have enough time in my day to follow all the interesting links of people still doing what we did back in that era, Mia.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I thought you meant. But I'm glad you just said out loud like platforms and sort of the sort of relinquishing to like bigger spaces or, just sort of, and then there's always that, if you sign in and set up your account, you don't read all of the, terms and, but I think you're speaking of politics of that kind of thing. And if you resist that and stay within small spaces that are like more controlled by your own domain, your own, that there'll be content that can be static. But that's where I ask Jon something, because like how does AI scrape, like where do they scrape from? What about the little small spaces? How does that, is that, can that be just as easily stolen, or is it not stolen because no one knows about it? I know I'm asking almost dumb questions, but I'm just being I don't care. I just want to hear what you guys have to say about it, because
Those are great questions, and I'm sure some folks here might know better than me. The essentially there are harvesters that were built for academic purposes, for research, that go out and they start at one link, and they go to that page, and that page might have linked to 3 other pages. And they download the HTML from that page, just like if you hit, Command S on a web page and saved the text to your hard drive. And then by following up on those next 3 pages, they've got now 3 more pages they can download, and each of those pages has links, and they go from there. So this was created by academics for, I think, perfectly legitimate purposes, which is like, hey, let's make sure we save the internet, and we can do studies on it and that sort of thing. But they made it open source or open access, and that meant that commercial companies like OpenAI and Google and so forth could use the same material. One of the most well-known sets is Common Crawl. For images, it's Lion 5B. But they're sort of like the basis of these transformer models is to be trained on all this public data. And if someone links to you anything of yours, these harvesters can find it. Interestingly, there's a whole lot of the web that doesn't have links going to it. And that stuff is invisible to transformers, to large language models and image generation and so forth. And people don't talk that much about it. But I used to work at a museum, and we had a website where, like a lot of larger organizations, there's a database in the back end. And when you go to like search for, let's say you search for a Mondrian painting, okay, like that one with the colors and sort of lines that I showed. You can search for Pete Mondrian at Guggenheim.org, and it will show you all the Mondrians in the collection. There is no like linkable page that you can get to see that. You have to search the database. And that content is not available by Google. You can't Google your way into it, and you can't crawl it. And some estimates have said that this so-called deep web that's not accessible, it could be behind a paywall, but it could also just be public but not linked to directly, is 500 times the size of the regular web, of the public web that we know. So, we think these models are trained on all of human knowledge. There's a lot of ways they're not. Back to the issue that Alan raised, the idea of a small web, that going back to older protocols and writing our own static HTML, which I do all the time. Like the slide deck that I gave you is literally HTML. I'm like tweaking it 5 minutes before the presentation. That's a way of sort of like going back to, it's almost like going to the farmer's market of the internet, right? Like we're going to go back and not have the processed food that came from China in a sealed container that's been on a refrigerator truck or, some kind of cargo ship for 3 months. And that's one way. We'll look at that when we get to solutions, but it's one way we might deal with this scary thing.
I also think, like, if you think you can stop it, you can't. And so I don't care. They can crawl my stuff, but I have it. And if anybody digs deep enough, they're going to find it under my own name. I think it's tough. You got to give up the idea that you can protect. If you want it not scraped, don't put it on the internet. It sounds harsh, but and what Jon is describing is stuff, yeah, that's generated from search results. That's fine. But also, what if I want to link to one of the Mondrian paintings? Then I have to, you can get there eventually from that, I think. But me, I don't think, it's just not worth thinking about. You can put fences around this and keep them out because they ignore the protocols that are out there.
That's also true. There have been evidence of so it's something you can do to stop crawlers. It's a little file, I'm sure Alan knows, called robots.txt that you can add into your web domain, and it says like, hey, don't crawl this. And most respectable organizations, the Internet Archive and its Wayback Machine will respect that, right? But AI companies have been caught cheating and just ignoring it, blow past it and just hoover down everything anyway. So we're in this position where we Cloudflare, which is a sort of backbone of a lot of the internet, has said, well, maybe we should step in and just stop this content, right there. So there's different, potential solutions, but a lot of them depend on good faith or believing in big actors to kind of have our back. I kind of feel like with Alan, like if we can do it ourselves and we know what we're doing, and that sort of DIY solution might actually be best. Let me show you all one more thing that I will give you to play with. And I think the art world is kind of its own thing, like, oh, interpretation. But I think everyone could get behind the idea of, like, if I go to the New York Times, I expect to see the same New York Times, that Christina sees or that, Meg sees. I don't expect to see a different headline. But I just developed a little exercise that gives you that experience. So let me show you what that would look like. And then
Sorry, John,
yeah,
can you just, there's one question.
yeah.
What was the name again of the stop crawling instruction that you can add? Can you repeat that? Or
So it's a
if you
little
can put it in
file.
the
It has a
chat, it would be
standard.
great.
It has a
Thank you.
standard file name. It's called robots.txt. So it's a TXT, like text file extension, and it literally is like the simplest little bit of code that you would ever write. And you make this little text file and you upload it into the same directory as your bunny.jpg and your index.html and all of your CSS and JavaScript and all that stuff. So when the crawler goes, because crawlers don't just go to a website and see it the way we do, they go into the directory and they look around everything public. They're supposed to look specifically for this file, and if they see it, they're supposed to look at it, and if it says don't crawl, they're supposed to be like, okay, not here. It's like a no trespassing sign for a web server.
Thank you.
And Alan's posted a Wikipedia entry, which would be much more explanation than I have for you.
Wonderful.
Let me show you this real quick. So I created something called the personalized web, which is sort of like it sounds good, but actually I meant it in a bad way. Let's see if I can find it here. Yeah. Okay. So let me post this link in the chat. So I'll show you how to do this. So if you go to this website, and this should work on mobile. The other one isn't really, like, it's too complicated for mobile. This one should work. Basically, what I'm going to ask you to do is under advanced, put in MYFest26, this phrase right here, because that will be like our cheat code for today. Because you're going to be using my like AI API service. And I can't do that forever, but I'm kind of like letting everyone here use it for free. And then choose a new source, adjust the slant, and rerun the headline. So what does that look like? It looks like this. So when you're here, you'll see a little advanced tab that you can kind of open and close here. Let me reload it so you can see what it looks like. And you can put in these other things, but under here where it says webinar access, just type MYFest26. And then you can close this tab or whatever. And now you see down here headlines. And these are literal headlines from the news today. It's possible to use this with canned headlines, but I wanted to show you that what's actually happening. So, apparently, it's a shooting in a high school in the Philippines. Alan Greenspan died. Keir Starmer resigned. Abortions, are going up, whatever. So these are all these sort of like headlines. Literally, like I checked it earlier today, and there were different headlines. So it's pulling them dynamically. By the way, it's pulling them dynamically using something called RSS, which is a nice one of those kind of small world, non-platforms that Alan represented. But in this case, I'm using it to prove a point. So then once you type that thing into advanced, pick a source that you trust for news, right? I trust MSN. I trust Al Jazeera. I trust BBC. I'm going to pick, sort of MSN for now, just just to make it obvious. And you can say, how hard do I want the headline to be slanted? And then personalize my feed, and the website will rewrite each of these headlines to be slanted toward the kind of reader or kind of viewer who would normally, look at that news source. So, now it's calling out Ayn Rand as for her radical libertarianism, raising global school safety concerns. MSN is going to slant toward gun control. And so they're going to, have that, as opposed to the original just said like 2 students in custody after shooting. It didn't mention anything about, safety globally. Supreme Court deals new blow to voting rights. In the original headline, it was just, allows a ruling that ends a tool. Abortion bans aren't stopping abortions, fueling a dramatic surge. And you can then compare that to something like, Fox News, and then rerun. And again, this is all happening live with AI. This is not like some, copywriter changing the headlines. The AI is just customizing them for you. No longer do we have any reference to sort of school, safety and school shooting. We have failed labor leader, abortion pill loophole. And if I want to make it even further, I can move it over from moderate to like blatant, and then we'll see the Fox News version. And let's see what this comes up with. Did it change? Oh, I need to rerun. It's like it got stuck. I'm going to reload that. Fox News. Okay. Personalize. Couldn't we say that? Oh, when you reload, you have to type back in the MYFest26 under advanced. Remember, if you're getting this message, couldn't reach the AI model, you need to do that. Make sure you type in under webinar access code MYFest26, all run together lowercase. And then you can personalize the feed, and it should say rewriting the record. And then, yeah. So give that a shot and see what you come up with. Forgotten history, Alan Greenspan's economic genius, globalist Starmer, left-wing activists exploit telehealth loopholes. So I hope you could see from this example and from your own experimenting with it that this could happen and you wouldn't know. Right? You could just be someone that this website or your browser happens to know often goes to Fox News or Al Jazeera or whatever. And you're literally getting a different version of today's headlines from maybe even the same website. Maybe the New York Times or, whatever CNN says like, hey, let's just like personalize the feed. And not just by selecting the content, but by actually changing the content. That's the danger that I want to point out here. And that's what I think is especially scary about this. So we could talk about solutions, but I think that's a good place to sort of like get some check-in with the group. And if you guys had any feedback on that little demo.
It's mind-blowing. Like I'm still, as Alan said, like no news anymore. We cannot yeah, wow.
I had asked a very long question in the chat. Sorry, it was just like so much good information. But for me, as I work in the K through 12 space, it just made me think a lot about personalized learning and how that's getting pushed so much in K through 12 education. It's like considered the epitome of the greatness that AI can bring. And of course, there are some really great things that personalization can do and validation and understanding where someone might be lost in something. But I always felt like there's something kind of scary about it or disconnecting about it. And it's just, but it stayed in my head kind of as I'm making those thoughts. But as you're speaking, it kind of made me say, yes, yes, like this is exactly what I worry about. If you have a whole class and everyone is learning something, not just that they're learning something different, but is it even real? Is it true? As a teacher, how do I really connect to them if what they're seeing is different from what I'm seeing? How do they connect to one another? And so I just wanted to know your thoughts and everyone's thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, let's hear what other people think about that.
I started to respond just in a very brief way, super quick, Shireen. I just said, where is relationality in learning, and how might we learn to think together in this sea of customization? Like, the bottom line is that when you're sitting in a seminar class, I mean, my own education will be revealed here, but if you're sitting around a room with like 15 other people and you're learning how to think and you're exploring angles on things and sparking each other's curiosity and, kind of bringing up evidence that comes directly from a shared text and expanding certain threads of thought in real time, dynamically in conversation, that is a kind of experience of vitality and aliveness. And literally, you're learning how to think in community with others. And I think what Jon is prompting us to think about today is, where will that be, if anywhere, if we're, mediating our experience of learning all the time, like, i.e., turning to the device. So, and I'm not a whatever it's called, like a neo-Luddite or anything like that. I obviously am like here in MYFest, but I am concerned about this kind of flying over the importance of relationality and listening and engagement, and its significant role in development. And then I'm struck also, just throwing out one more word before I'm quiet again, and I promise I'll be quiet. I like the word incentive. I don't know if I like it, but I think it's like a lightning rod word. Like, when you were talking about it earlier, Jon, I just circled that word incentive a lot. How are our values incentivized? What are the assumptions behind what incentivizes us at this point in time in human history? I think that's a key part of what your expose today, in a way, is thinking. Underlying that is this whole question of the problem of what we're incentivized by, or what is assumed about what we're incentivized by. Okay, now I'm going to be quiet.
Good stuff. Other reactions or suggestions or solutions or hand-wringing? I will throw out one just kind of aside, which is, I feel that a lot of the reason that that AI gets the hype, but much of the incentive that companies have for building out data centers is not AI, it is ad tracking. And I've posted on various social media recently about the reasons I have for that conclusion.
Will you share with us?
Yeah,
Sure.
That was like a teaser.
I know it sounds radical. It's a contrarian view. Short version is that industry reports that data centers still, the AI load on them is only 20% of data centers, which is shocking given that it's been 3 years since, ChatGPT, and the hype is all like, oh no, we're building these things so we have this shiny AI future. I did a little more focused kind of analysis recently, which is like, based on the estimates of the amount of energy that is used, we can say what proportion of data centers built since ChatGPT, since November of 2022, is being used by AI, right? Because that if AI is really the driver, then all of them should be used mostly by AI. It should be like 80 or 90%. It's less than half. So what the hell? Like, why are we being sold that we need these wonderful new monstrous facilities in our backyard if it's not going to cure cancer and make it easier to write polite emails or whatever, find recipes, whatever the AI has promised us? And I think the reason is that this hardware can be repurposed for a demonstrably valuable product, which is tracking people, basically surveillance capitalism, where they say, oh, you bought this toothbrush and you also, bought this hand cream. So we're we're going to give you this other skincare product in our next ad. And that is very computationally intensive, but it's even less savory to communities than AI. Like there's this huge like backlash against AI, but imagine if these people came to your community and said like, we want to build this huge thing that's going to use up all this energy and water and rezone your entire downtown. Oh, and we're going to use it to sell you Ozempic. I don't think any community would say yes to that. So that's my contrarian perspective.
Thank you for sharing that.
I want to talk a little bit about, is there any nostalgia for those of us who are old enough to remember, Web.1? And I think, Alan has revealed that he is. Any nostalgia for like back when people had, their own blogs, back when, people would make websites by hand, web rings, RSS readers. Anybody remember Google Reader? Or NetNewsWire, there's still Feedly, there's still RSS readers out there. But those of you who don't know, they just get whatever headlines from whatever sources you say. Like, I want ESPN and I want the Bangor Daily News and I want, Wall Street Journal or something. And you just get those headlines. They're not like selected like, oh, this is the one we think you'll want. There were a lot of really interesting ways of creating community back in the day. It was harder to find things. You had to go out and search. It was more work. You had to learn some HTML or use a WYSIWYG editor. Does anybody pine for those days like I do?
I don't know if it's pining. I mean, I would say, John, I'm just glad I got to be part of that and to taste it. But I don't see like going back or any. I don't think you're suggesting that.
Yeah.
But it does say like all this stuff is possible. And where did we go so much in? Again, I feel like my metaphor is like we've all decided that instead of going like coming and visiting each other in our houses, all we do is hanging out at the mall. And I think collectively we have some part in this because I'm just a little bit horrified as how deep people have thrown into LinkedIn. I abhor LinkedIn personally. Um, and it's like the need for attention and et cetera. But LinkedIn is like right there in all the extractive surveillance capitalism platforms. And I'm going through a process. We have our Open Education Global Awards announcements. I'm a little bit horrified as the primary link that people have is LinkedIn. Um, that's not durable. That's not, you know, that I don't trust that's going to be around as your record in the future. And so it just, to me, like the decay of that, what you describe in the day when people said like, this is my stuff. And I don't see it going back to that much, but I think it's there enough. So yeah, the nostalgia is like it was good, and we understand what it was like to have those network communities. Um, Also, I say like we forget how many more people there are in the space. I mean, the scale of people who are involved in being online in the era we're talking about is like orders of magnitude less than now. And so that's why it's not even possible to find again.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to throw out another solution for educators because this is a question for all of us. That was it. Shireen, who has the K through 12 classroom, is that right? The K
Yeah.
younger. So, I think there are band-aids. They're not perfect. I agree with Alan. We can't go backwards. But things like RSS readers are like you choose what the content is. Sites like AllSides or Ground News, right? So they're news aggregators that try to represent the spectrum of viewpoints on an issue. And they have their issues. Like it's usually like a sort of a left or right, is the spectrum. Well, politics is more complicated than left or right, but at least it's something. And so when you go look up, I don't know, the Washington reflecting pool or the Iran war, you're going to see a spectrum of stories that you can link to that show that there are very different kind of perspectives. It's kind of like a version of the demo, the personalized web demo that I showed you, except that it's not implicit, it's very explicit, and you can see all the kind of versions at once.
Yeah.
So, I think, Yeah, go
I
ahead.
completely agree with that. That those are exactly my feelings too when it comes to teaching that type of literacy or teaching when we think of like teaching reading or ELA, and that's more my area, the ELA classrooms, the social studies classrooms. It's teaching them about these systems and having them see how different media, how some sources will push for certain things, will not, how the algorithm will kind of bring them information versus what wouldn't, how things are personalized. And really this has become just as important a type of learning of how to read as anything else. It's like that idea called the biliterate brain that a lot of times will yearn so much for just wanting to read that print reading and will really look down on all aspects of digital reading. But at the same time, digital reading and knowing how to do it is so important because we will just get so lost and caught up in everyone else's knowledge and what they value and what they think is important and what they want to sell. So if we don't know how to switch between both modes, then we kind of get lost. The print reading gives us the deep reading, the empathy, the ability to be critical. And I think that this type of digital and media literacy teaches us how to, what's the word I'm looking for? Like it teaches us how to engage in civic society, if that makes sense. Like does that make sense? I don't know. I'm just kind of rambling of what I mean. These two types of readings.
Okay, I think we're about at time. Any closing words, John?
Uh, just it's tempting to solve this by saying, we're going to outlaw AI or we're going to enforce copyright. I don't think those are reasonable. But I do think we can, enact data center moratoriums until we figure some of this stuff out. We came super close in Maine to having a moratorium for I think it was 12 months or so, and vetoed at the last moment by an outgoing governor. But I think we can also do real practical things with our students, like have them, source check AI, have them be forced to read the same story from two outlets with very different perspectives. And some of this is like classic kind of, digital literacy, but in this new world, they also need to be able to kind of smell a deep fake when they see one, and know that the things that we hear that sound really good, like we're going to be augmented or we're going to have our content personalized, also have sometimes a kind of a hidden side that might be used against us. So thanks everyone. I've got stuff to think about. I'm going to save the chat and go back and look at what you guys said. Really appreciate you joining me on this look over a dystopian horizon, but one that I hope we can see coming. That was the goal of today's webinar.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
John.
It was amazing.
Excellent.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Can I remind everyone that Heather shared the feedback link? If you have time, takes a couple of minutes only, but we appreciate so much your feedback on sessions. Thank you so much.
And feel free to follow up, especially on LinkedIn. That's a great platform, I hear.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.